listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we just completed the Jazz Zone. T.N. Providence just did his tribute to Robert Nesta Marley, Bob Marley, and joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne this is the Women's Month, and Gerald Horne has written a great book, which I recommend everyone pick up, called Race Woman: The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois, and he's also written about 50 other volumes. And Dr. Horne, first of all, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm fine. And yourself?
As Sam Cooke once said, I'm wonderful. I have no major complaints.
Okay.
I'm all right.
Good.
All right. So we wanted to essentially that's the first thing we wanted to talk about is the ICC's sanctions. What's your take on that?
With regard to Israel, you mean?
Yes.
Well, let me actually start with what is probably the most pressing and burning issue of this particular moment. And that is, as we speak, bloody massacres are unfolding in Syria. Massacres of minorities in particular, including the Allawites, who have been associated for various reasons with the previous regime of President al-Assad, who you may recall was ousted some weeks ago, and he fled to Russia. Taking his place was ISIS rebranded, Al-Qaeda rebranded. Mr. al-Jilani, the leader, doffed his military uniform and put on a business suit with a tie, although interestingly enough, he refused to shake hands with the German foreign minister, presumably because she was a woman. But in any case, he had pledged to be a maestro of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that religious minorities, particularly Christians, Alawites, Druze, had nothing to fret about. But as we speak, if you have the stomach, you can see actually gruesome and grisly episodes of ethnic cleansing taking place in Syria. And my challenge to many of our friends on the left who were cheerleaders for the overthrow of al-Assad, and some of these same forces, of course, were cheerleaders for the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya in particular, is to be in touch with your elected representatives and demand that this question be taken to the United Nations. Interestingly enough, what's happening as we speak, once again, is that those who are seeking to flee the bloodshed are trying to enter into a Russian encampment that still exists, although their ally, Mr. al-Assad, was dislodged, as noted. And that is rather ironic indeed, that those who some of our friends on the left had castigated and condemned now seem to be the final option for those seeking to escape massacre.
Dr. Horne, could I ask you this question? What the Alawites, like Islam and Christianity have various branches. What is, in a nutshell, what are the, do they believe someone else was supposed to follow Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah? What exactly is briefly for the Alawites? What makes them different?
Well, as you probably know, and I should have mentioned it in my opening remarks, those who are being accused, at least, of perpetuating these massacres are from the so-called Sunni branch of Islam, and they are deeply influenced, I'm afraid to say, by the kinds of religious sectarianism that has flowed in recent decades from Saudi Arabia in particular, which tends to see other non-Sunni Muslims as being not worthy of life. In fact, the kinds of rhetoric that's being directed at the Alawites in Syria right now is rather blood-curdling. And I hate to say this, but it reminds me of the kind of rhetoric that was directed at various ethnic groups in Rwanda in 1994 as the genocide began to unfold there. Now, with regard to the Alawites, or also transliterated as Alevi or Lavi or Alvi, Alawid, or Alawite, French Alawite, is an adjective denoting of or related to Ali, the Prophet Muhammad cousin, for example. And so these are rather ancient lineages that we're referring to, but it's fair to say that irrespective of the ancient lineages, what has helped to fan the flames is the kind of theological and religious sectarianism flowing from Syria's neighbor in Saudi Arabia.
All right, that made that pretty clear. Is that it on Syria? Did you want to deal with the ICC sanctions?
Well, with regard to the ICC, I mean, it's difficult to see where that's going to be going in light of what's happening now with President Trump. Now, on the one hand, President Trump has supposedly opened talks with Hamas, which did not take place under his predecessor, President Biden. Many are interpreting that in some ways as undercutting Mr. Netanyahu and the Israeli regime altogether. Keep in mind that the Israeli regime has not backed away from its notion that Hamas should be devastated, eradicated, liquidated, etc. And yet you have their close ally, the United States, engaging in talks. Of course, the talks are about the return of captives held by Hamas, supposedly, or U.S. nationals. But at the same time, supposedly in Israel, there is concern that as Mr. Trump seeks to clear the decks for this ultimate confrontation and showdown with the People's Republic of China, which of course has led to these companion maneuvers in Europe, pulling the rug out from under Mr. Zelensky in Ukraine, which has sent the European Union and Britain into a sort of frenzy, that he may be doing the same thing with regard to Israel as well. But the question then becomes, what does that mean with regard to this effort of the International Criminal Court to go after Israeli leaders, including Mr. Netanyahu? Well, in light of the fact that Mr. Netanyahu visited Washington at a time when these ICC charges were held over his head, and as far as I could tell, there was no attempt by the U.S. authorities to detain or arrest Mr. Netanyahu. There was no attempt, as far as I could tell, for a citizen's arrest of Mr. Netanyahu. It's probably the case that even if a frostiness develops between Mr. Netanyahu and the White House, it's unclear if that will give momentum, from the U.S. side at least, for further prosecution in the International Criminal Court of the Israeli war criminals.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne. I think Belinda has a question for you.
Do we want to move to Trump speech and what it reveals?
Well, it was quite remarkable. It was a mishmash of demagogy, hypocrisy, lies, and contradictions. He gave a speech to a joint session of the U.S. Congress, the House and the Senate, this past Tuesday. It was an equivalent of a State of the Union address, but it was not a State of the Union address. In terms of contradictions, of course, he talked about celebrating free speech. At the same time, he's cracking down on the attempt, even in law schools, to teach critical race theory. In fact, a major target of the Trump regime is the university sector, because the university sector is projected and perceived as housing so-called tenured radicals, like myself, for example. And there's going to be pressure on universities to crack down on the so-called free speech rights of people like myself, not to mention our political latitude, for example. I should also mention that he talked about having a commission to make America healthy again under vaccine denialist Robert F. Kennedy Jr., nephew of the slain U.S. president, son of the slain former U.S. Attorney General. And yet, Mr. Trump and Elon Musk, his South African comrade, are busily cutting the budgets of the National Institutes for Health, which has as a mission precisely to track down infectious diseases and other threats to the health of the body politic. He uplifted a Black child cancer survivor in a very demagogic maneuver. And yet at the same time, with regard to these random chemicals in the environment that are probably and likely contributing to this cancer epidemic that's we're confronting in the United States, he's cutting the budgets for those agencies too, including the Environmental Protection Administration. He gave a shout out to law enforcement and did not mention that one of his first acts as president was to give a clean bill of health, a pardon to these criminals and miscreants who attacked law enforcement viciously and physically on January 6, 2021, in an attempted coup d'etat. And at the same time, we all know that with this tariff war that's unfolding against Canada, against Mexico, against the People's Republic of China, that Mr. Trump is driving the economy of the United States into the ditch. And I should also mention that with regard to Canada, where I'm now sitting, we are all awaiting who will win the race to succeed Mr. Trudeau as leader of the Liberal Party and presumably Prime Minister. And of course, we expect that there will be an election in Canada shortly. But I must say that from skimming and scanning and reading the Canadian press, that there is a lot of outrage in Canada right now with regard to their neighbor, the United States of America. There's confusion, there's anger, there's betrayal. But to a certain extent, Canada should have seen this coming. If they had been studying Canadian history like some of us have, they would recognize in the 19th century, there were sharp contradictions between Canada and the United States of America, not least because Canada had a sanctuary for fleeing enslaved Africans, for example, and that this outrage Washington, D.C., it led to a war in 1812 where enslaved Africans in Washington helped to burn down Washington, D.C. in league with the British Redcoats. And all of that history was swept under the rug for various reasons, as far as I can tell. And now there seems to be confusion as to how to proceed in Canada, particularly with regard to what I've been reading in the Canadian press about how if the United States invaded, there would be a guerrilla war in Canada that would last for decades on end. I was rather stunned to read that. I mean, that shows you how bad things have gotten. And in any case, it seems to me that I'm not sure if the Canadian elites, who of course have disregarded the lessons of history that I just enumerated, are really prepared for the challenge that's ahead, particularly with regard to the northern part of this country. That is to say, the territory stretching towards the Arctic Circle, because Canada has negative relations with Russia, for example, and I can talk about that with regard to my research in this country concerning British Columbia, if you so choose. And they also have negative relations with China and with India, and now with the United States of America. So they're going to have to cut a deal with one of those powers. I'm not sure which one. But on the positive side, I've noticed that there have been delegations meeting, trans-border delegations of the Communist Party of Canada, the Communist Party of the United States with their counterparts in Mexico. I would like to see that particular kind of huddling be emulated by the Social Democrats, for example, the NDP, the New Democratic Party, the Social Democrats who have significant influence here in British Columbia should be reaching out, and vice versa, to the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. We need the NAACP to be reaching across the border, although I'm not going to hold my breath until that happens. But certainly there is an ongoing crisis in North America with no end in sight.
You're listening to Diasporic Music. We are kind of tight on time, so I wanted to double up on a couple of these questions. First of all, I wanted you to continue on, the international situation. Could you talk about is China winning without fighting? And then I would like for you to give us an update on Black BC's research, your research on Black British Columbia.
Well, there have been headlines in the press lately about Sun Tzu, TZU, at least that's how it's transliterated into English, the fabled, well-known Chinese philosopher, who suggested that it's always best to win without fighting. And if you look at the recent history of China, that's really what they've been doing. That is to say, as we've said many times in the past, they cut this deal with the United States a half century ago against the interests of the Soviet Union, which led to massive foreign direct investment in China, which has created this juggernaut. Now the United States is trying to overturn that fateful decision, but it's unclear to me if the United States is capable of waging war effectively and victoriously against the People's Republic of China. And in fact, out of the Chinese Foreign Ministry just a few days ago was the rather stunning statement that China is prepared for tariff wars, trade wars, or any other kind of war the United States would like to mount. And so, given the fact that the United States is alienating allies in Canada and Western Europe and elsewhere, it's unclear to me if U.S. imperialism is up to the task, up to the challenge. And if so, that means that to a certain degree, China is winning without fighting, which is, I guess, the best way to win. Now, with regard to British Columbia, as I've mentioned previously, I believe, what's striking about the history of this Canadian province is that the prime leader at the time it was gaining traction was a man of African ancestry, Sir James Douglas. There's a major statue in his honor in downtown Victoria, British Columbia, the erstwhile capital of this province, and there are streets named after him as well. But what's also striking is that at a time when Black people were being chased out of California, out of Oregon, recall that when Oregon becomes a part of the United States, they have specific laws and mandates directing that no Black people can live in Oregon. That's one of the reasons why Portland, Oregon, one of the most significant cities in the United States of America, to this very day has a relatively small Black population. And this is how the left misinterprets U.S. history. Because they said that no Black people, including slaves, could reside in Oregon, the idea was, according to our friends on the left, was that Oregon was abolitionist. They make it sound progressive when you have this sort of apartheid mandate. But in any case, Sir James Douglas mandated, or he directed, that these folks move to British Columbia, which many of them did. But the irony is that in coming to British Columbia, they not only took up arms against a possible U.S. incursion, as noted, they not only took up arms against a possible Russian incursion from the north, because keep in mind that Russia controlled Alaska, BC's neighbor, until 1867, but it also suggested that these Black men from the United States of America would take up arms against the First Nations, who, of course, were not necessarily happy about these settlers. And since I am in the early stages of this research, I would appreciate hearing from those in your audience who have research tips with regard to not only the Black experience in BC in the period I'm studying, which is the 19th century, but any other period. Because, of course, in a book like this, you'll have a postscript, you'll have an epilogue, where you might even bring the issues up to the present day. And I'm particularly interested in how or whether Black people played a role in the ascendancy of the NDP, the Social Democrats, the New Democratic Party, which, as I said, has significant influence in this province. And I would also be interested to learn and to know, if those in your audience have knowledge, whether or not there is connection between the fact that the most populous indigenous, the most significant indigenous populations in Canada are in Ontario, which of course has a population significantly larger than that of British Columbia, and in BC itself. And I'd be interested to know if that's a kind of accident of history, or if that is a result of any policies pursued by Sir James Douglas, who, by the way, had ancestral roots in Guyana.
Well, let me say this. There was a young man, I think he was a professional football player, and my memory is he came out of, I think he played football in the U.S. He came to British Columbia and became very prominent in politics. I can't Google it right now, but I'll have that information for you on the air. But I'll have that next week. But I'll also have that information from you through email. Probably later today.
Good.
Yeah, he was. I believe he was. He might have played. I don't think he played Canadian football. I think he was a pro football player in the U.S. and he came to BC. Might have been Vancouver, and he was very big in I'm certain he was in the NDP, and he got a lot of support at the time, because I was writing for Contrast, the Black Weekly in Toronto, and I'll have that information for you later on today.
Good, and I welcome others to emulate you. And
I think Melinda we're running out of. I guess we have a little bit more time, but you had we have quite a few questions for you, but we can continue with Melinda.
Did we want to continue and finish off the Canadian auto workers split?
Well, this is what I mean when I was talking about the necessity to build bridges across the border, because Unifor, the Canadian auto workers, formerly the Canadian auto workers, have been quite hostile to Mr. Trump's tariff proposals. And I think it's fair to say that that's the case across the board in Canada, at least in BC. When you go to the grocery stores, they have these signs encouraging you to buy Canadian products, for example. Now, obviously, to a certain extent, you can say this is a capitulation to the national bourgeoisie. But on the other hand, I think it also reflects a revulsion at the attempt by U.S. imperialism to snuff out the sovereignty of its northern neighbor. I think Mr. Trudeau has a point when he suggests that what Trump intends is to collapse the Canadian economy so that Canada can be annexed and the United States can seize all of its natural resources. At the same time, of course, the United Auto Workers in the United States of America have not been hostile to Mr. Trump's tariff proposals because, as they see it, this will lead to so-called reshoring. That is to say that there will be shutting down of plants in Canada and moving across the border from Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan, for example. And therefore, the United Auto Workers will have more dues-paying members as a result. We really need to bridge that gap between these two unions. And I would urge, if they haven't done so already, for the leaders of these unions to come together on a common position, because I'm not sure, matter of fact, I am reasonably sure that it's not in the best interest of the working class on either side of the border for the two unions to be adopting these contrasting positions.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. And, this Trump is welcoming Afrikaners. And I remember, years ago, there would be debates in the Black community in the U.S. and in Canada about whether or not we should spell Africa with a C or a K. And I find it very strange that, these Afrikaners, they use the K. Could you comment on, those two things?
Well, as you know, in 1652, you had an invasion of the southern tip of Africa, what is now the Cape and Cape Town, by Dutch Protestants who dubbed themselves Afrikaners. They were quickly joined by French Protestants who were fleeing for their lives in light of the hegemony of French Catholics in the hexagonal nation. And they, of course, waged war against the indigenous population. In fact, established slavery in the southern tip of Africa, oftentimes with not only Mozambican slaves, but slaves from another Dutch so-called possession, speaking of what is now Indonesia, that is to say, formerly the Dutch East Indies. And we know that ultimately they were ousted from power by 1994. But we also know that their legacy, their toxic legacy, continues insofar as a number of top advisors to Mr. Trump, including Elon Musk and David Sachs and Peter Thiel and Ola Botha, Joe Pollock, are all refugees from apartheid. And it's rather perversely ironic that the so-called anti-immigrant Mr. Trump is welcoming people from South Africa who say they don't even want to leave because they have a good deal. And they will not necessarily have a good deal if they come here, I guarantee you. So this is part of the contradictions of capital. It's part of the contradictions of imperialism as it writhes in agony. And I should also say something I've been saying all along, which is that this is also a reflection of weakness of U.S. imperialism, weakness in the face of the challenge from China, the challenge of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which has led Mr. Trump to alienate Canada, alienate Western Europe, and now presumably alienating the government of South Africa under the leadership of the African National Congress.
Well, I wanted to say that Imam Jamil Al-Amin has stage 4 cancer, and his son is his lawyer. And as he always says, he has a bit of advice for the left. That advice is don't get left. I would like for you people to go to their social media and give H. Rap Brown, Jamil Al-Amin, do what we can for him. They were forced to move him to a different hospital where he could get the treatment. So I think we should try to put pressure on the people, on the state, to actually hopefully he could get his own, we could get a doctor of his son's or his family's choosing. That's just my humble opinion. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Horne?
Well, I see the time's expiring, so I'll look to speak to you soon.
All right, thank you. And I would like to thank Lisa Watson for her technical brilliance per usual, and Melinda Francis. I guess we can close the show.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.